There was a girl in the village of Kirin who talked to animals the way most people talk to their neighbors. Not in a loud or demanding way, not with treats held out like bribes. She simply sat near them, kept her hands still, and made sounds so low that most adults could not hear them at all. Her name was Mara. She was 7 years old the first time she sat beside an injured dog in the mud near the river, and 20 minutes later, the dog, which had snapped at 3 grown men who tried to help it, rested its head against her knee. The men who watched this did not know what to make of it. One of them laughed and called it luck. Another said nothing, which was the smarter response. Her mother, who had been watching from 20 feet away, pressed one hand to her mouth and said nothing at all. Mara did not think what she had done was remarkable. She had only done what felt obvious to her. The dog was frightened. Frightened creatures do not want help right away. They want to be understood first. They want to know that the one approaching them has no intention of adding to their fear. She had sat down in the mud, turned her body sideways so she was not facing the dog directly, because a direct stare is a threat, and she had understood this before anyone told her. And she had waited. She had breathed slowly. She had let the dog decide. That was all. But the village of Kirin was a small place, tucked between a forest that ran north for 60 miles without interruption and a road that led south to a town most people left as soon as they were old enough to drive. Small places have long memories, and in small places, the thing that makes a child different becomes the thing that child is known for the rest of their life, whether they want that or not. From the age of 7, Mara was the girl who talked to animals. It was not, in the beginning, a cruel distinction. Children at school found it interesting. They would bring her insects in jars or point out birds on fence posts and ask her what those creatures were thinking. She would say she did not know what they were thinking. She was not able to read minds, but she could sometimes tell if they were calm or afraid or hungry just by looking at how they held themselves. This satisfied no one, but also offended no one, and so those early years were mostly peaceful. She had one close friend in those years, a girl named Lena, who had red hair and a loud laugh, and who had no interest in animals personally, but found Mara endlessly interesting, the way a person might find a river interesting. There was always something moving through it, something you had not seen before. Lena was the kind of person who made every situation feel lighter. Where Mara was quiet, Lena was noise. Where Mara watched, Lena asked. They were, by most measures, a strange pair, but they were inseparable from the age of 6 to the age of 14, and that friendship was the longest period of uncomplicated happiness Mara would know for many years. The wolves arrived when Mara was 9. Not physically. They had always been in the forest, always been a presence that the older men of Kirin acknowledged in a practical, guarded way, the way one acknowledges a river that might one day flood. But the summer Mara was 9. A drought pushed the deer population out of the northern sections of the forest, and the wolves followed the deer south, and for the first time in many years, wolf tracks appeared near the edges of the village. 3 sheep were taken from a farm on the western hill in the space of 2 weeks. A calf went missing. Suddenly the wolves were not an abstract presence, they were a problem. The village men formed a group. They met in the evenings at the house of a farmer named Davin, who had lost the calf, and they discussed what was to be done. Some wanted to contact the government wildlife office. Some wanted to set traps. Devon himself wanted something simpler and more direct, and he said so plainly, and no one at those meetings wrote down what he said, which was intentional. Mara knew about these meetings the way children know about adult conversations, through the silences that followed them, through the tightened faces of her parents, through the way certain topics were changed when she walked into a room. She did not know the specifics, but she knew that the forest, which had always felt like something welcoming to her, had become something that the village was deciding how to feel about. And she felt, at 9 years old, a loyalty she could not fully explain. A loyalty that was not to the village. She began going to the forest's edge in the mornings, before school. She told her mother she was going to collect plants. Her mother, who was a practical woman with many things demanding her attention, accepted this explanation without much scrutiny. Mara did not collect plants. She sat at the place where the farmland stopped and the tree line began, and she watched the shadows between the trunks. She watched for movement. She watched the way the birds in the canopy behaved, because birds told you things. If the birds were disturbed, something large had moved through recently. If the birds were calm, everything was as it should be. She learned to read the forest's edge, the way she had learned to read the dog in the mud, not as a foreign language, but as a feeling in the body, a posture, a held breath or a released one. She never saw a wolf that entire summer, but she felt them, not in any mystical way. She felt them the way you feel that a room has recently held many people, even when it is now empty. A warmth that has not fully dissipated, a particular stillness that is different from the stillness of a room that has never been occupied. She felt the weight of large creatures that were nearby and had chosen not to be seen, and this too she understood. Hiding was not cowardice. Hiding was strategy. She respected it. By October, the deer had moved, and the wolves had followed, and the crisis, such as it was, settled down. The farmers of Kirin breathed easier. The meetings at Davin's house stopped, but Mara did not stop going to the forest's edge. She had found something there, not the wolves, something in herself, a steadiness she had not known she possessed, a capacity for waiting that felt, when she sat at that tree line in the pale morning light, like a kind of power, not power over anything, power that simply was. She was 9 years old, and she did not have the words for any of this, but the feeling was real, and she carried it home with her every morning, and it made the school day bearable, and the evenings at the kitchen table bearable, and the slow march of an ordinary childhood bearable. She carried that feeling like a stone in her pocket, something solid to touch when the world felt too loud. The winter she turned 14 was the winter everything changed. It started with the creek. She had been walking the path that ran along the eastern edge of the forest on a Saturday in November, a gray morning with low clouds and the smell of coming snow, when she heard a sound from the water below the bank. She almost kept walking, but the sound repeated, not the sound of water over rock, which she knew well, but a sound that was smaller and higher and somehow careful, the sound of something trying not to be heard. She stopped. She went to the edge of the bank. She looked down. A wolf, young, she judged it to be less than a year old, was standing in the shallows of the creek. Its left front leg was lifted, not touching the water, and even from 10 feet above, she could see the way it held that leg, the particular stillness of something in pain that has learned to be very quiet about it. Its coat was dark gray, with a stripe of lighter fur along its back. Its ears were up. It had heard her stop. It was watching her now, and she knew with absolute certainty that if she moved wrong, toward it, or fast, it would either bolt or it would show her its teeth, and both outcomes would end badly. She sat down at the edge of the bank, right there in the mud and the dead leaves. She did not climb down. She did not reach toward it. She turned herself sideways, the way she had turned herself sideways 8 years before in the mud beside the injured dog, because she knew that a direct approach meant dominance, and dominance was not what was needed here. What was needed was time. She breathed. She looked at the water rather than at the animal. She let the silence settle around her like something being carefully placed. 20 minutes passed. The young wolf did not move. Then another 20. The clouds shifted. The light changed slightly. Mara did not look at the wolf. She looked at the water, and at the stones in the water, and at the way the surface of the creek moved differently over deep places than over shallow ones. She let the morning happen around her. She was in no hurry. She had nowhere to be. She was, at 14 years old, a girl who had nowhere important to be and had made her peace with that. And it turned out that this particular quality of having nothing urgent was precisely what the young wolf needed from her. She became aware, without looking, that the wolf had sat down in the water. She could feel it in the small sounds of the creek, which had subtly changed. She felt the shift, the way you feel when someone who was nervous in a room finally sits. Not because of any sound they make, but because the air is different when tension leaves a body. She looked at the wolf then, slowly. The way you read a page you have already read once and know to be safe. It was watching her. It was still frightened, but it was not ready to run. She reached into her coat pocket, slowly, very slowly, and brought out a piece of dried venison that she had taken from the kitchen. She had been bringing food into the forest for years, out of pure habit, not expecting anything from it, and she held it out on a flat palm, her arm extended, not toward the wolf, but beside her body, angled slightly away. An offering that did not demand to be taken. An offering that said, "It is here if you want it, and if you do not want it, that is also acceptable to me." The wolf sat in the water for another 10 minutes. Then it stood. Then it walked, slowly, on 3 legs, favoring the injured one, to the base of the bank below her, and stretched its neck, and took the piece of venison from her palm, and moved back 2 steps, and ate it in 3 bites, and then sat down again, and looked at her. She let out a breath she had been holding for so long she had forgotten she was holding it. She came back the next morning. The wolf was there. She brought more food. And this time it came after only a few minutes. And this time it stood close enough that she could see the injury on its leg. A deep cut, possibly from a wire fence or a trap, that had closed but not healed cleanly. She had no way to treat it. She brought food for 3 more days, and on the 4th day the wolf was not at the creek, and she worried through the entire school day and could not concentrate on anything her teacher said. And when she went back to the forest in the afternoon, the wolf was higher on the bank, in the shelter of a large root system, and when it saw her it stood up and walked toward her on all 4 legs, still limping but putting weight on the left front now. And she knelt in the leaves, and the wolf pressed its head against the side of her neck for 1 moment before stepping back, and she understood that to be the only thank you it had the language for, and she accepted it. She did not tell anyone, not even Lena. She should have told Lena. She knows this now. But there was something about the creek and the wolf and the mornings by the tree line that felt too private for words, like a letter you write to yourself. Putting it into speech would have changed it into something else, something that required explanation and justification and a response, and she did not want any of those things. She wanted it to remain what it was, a thing that belonged to her in its entirety. But Lena, who had red hair and a loud laugh, and was 14 and curious about everything, had followed her one morning, just to see, just because she was bored and Mara had been distracted for weeks. And she had seen Mara at the creek, and she had seen the wolf, And she had done what 14-year-olds do with extraordinary things. She had told someone. Not everyone, just one person, but that was enough. By Friday of that week, the story was different. The story was that Mara kept a wolf, that she had trained it somehow, that it came to her and she fed it from her hand and it followed her. The story grew as stories always do in small places, through the addition of details that no one verified and everyone preferred to the simpler truth. By the following week, there were 2 wolves. By the week after that, she was going into the forest at night, which she had never done. Most of the children at school found this interesting. Some found it frightening. A few found it amusing, which is the most dangerous category, because the ones who find unusual things amusing are the ones most likely to say so out loud in groups. They began calling her Wolf Girl. She had expected something like this. She had not expected how much it would cost. Lena apologized 3 times, in 3 different ways, on 3 different days, and Mara believed each apology and forgave each apology because she understood why it had happened. Lena had not been malicious. She had been 14 and excited and unable to hold something extraordinary by herself for very long. Mara did not blame her for this, but the friendship shifted anyway, the way things shift when a weight is placed on them. Not broken, but different, and from then on, there was always the memory of the weight even when it was removed, and the thing was never quite the same shape it had been before. She spent the rest of her teenage years at the edge of 2 worlds, the village of Kiran, which she lived in but never quite felt she belonged to, and the forest, which she did not live in, but to which she returned every morning as though she were clocking in for work. She kept going to the tree line. She kept sitting still. Over 4 years, she encountered wolves 11 times. She never touched any of them, except on the day she encountered a female with a thorn deep in her paw, and the female, after 40 minutes of shared stillness, allowed Mara to remove it. That encounter lasted 3 hours, and Mara did not eat or drink or move from that clearing until it was finished, and when the female walked back into the trees, Mara sat in the clearing until her legs stopped shaking. She wrote everything down, in notebooks that she kept under a loose board beneath her bed. Not scientific notes. She had no training in science. No one had given her that language yet, but precise, careful observations. The way wolves held their ears in different situations. The way they moved their weight when they were uncertain. The difference between a wolf that was aggressive and a wolf that was afraid and performing aggression to cover it. Because these were not the same thing, and responding to them identically was a mistake. She wrote about the stillness she used and why she thought it worked. She wrote about what seemed to fail and when. She crossed things out and rewrote them and crossed them out again. She was building something. She did not know what to call it. She simply kept building. High school ended. She did not leave Kiran the way her classmates did, moving south to the university town or west to the city. She stayed, not because she lacked ambition. She had a very specific ambition, one that did not require a city, but because the forest was here, and the wolves were here, and she had work to do that did not make sense anywhere else. Her parents accepted this with the particular combination of love and mild bafflement that parents often have for children who are very different from them. They did not pressure her. They asked occasionally if she was happy. She always said yes, and it was mostly true. She applied to a wildlife conservation program at the regional university 3 years after graduation, and was rejected. The rejection letter was polite. She read it twice, put it in a drawer, and went to the forest the next morning. She applied to a different program the following year and was placed on a waiting list. She never heard back. She put that letter in the same drawer. She sent a paper, a real paper, 30 pages, written in the best scientific language she had managed to teach herself, to a wildlife journal. The rejection came with a note that said her observations were interesting, but her methodology was undocumented, and her sample size was too small. She read the note several times. The word interesting sat in her chest like a splinter. She went back to the forest. She did not stop writing. She did not stop sitting at the tree line in the mornings, or going deeper into the forest on weekends, always with the same stillness, always with the same patience. And over those years, she had encounters that would have been, to any researcher in the field, remarkable. She watched a pack care for an elder wolf that could no longer hunt, bringing food to it, adjusting their routes to accommodate its slower pace. She watched two rival males negotiate a territory boundary through posture and sound over the course of 2 hours without ever making physical contact. She watched a mother communicate the location of danger to 4 young wolves through a sequence of body positions that she had seen repeated in similar situations before, and she wrote every detail into her notebook with a precision that came from years of watching and caring and refusing to look away. The village of Kiran did not change its opinion of her. If anything, the opinion solidified. She was in her mid-20s now, unmarried, no city job, spending her days wandering the forest like something that had gone feral. The farmers still watched the tree line the same way their fathers had. Davin's son, who had inherited the farm, had lost 2 sheep to wolves the previous winter and spoke about her at the general store in the way you speak about someone who has chosen the wrong side. She heard the things that were said. In a village, you always hear the things that are said. She absorbed them the way she absorbed cold mornings and wet boots and the rejection letters in the drawer, as weather, as the cost of being where she was. One evening she was sitting at the counter of the village's only cafe, which was also its only restaurant, which was also, on Friday nights, its only bar. A man she recognized from school, older than her by a few years, someone she had never spoken to much, sat down 2 stools away and ordered coffee. He worked at the forestry office, which she knew. He had dark eyes, and the particular ease of a person who spent most of his time outdoors. His name was Wren. He did not bring up the wolves immediately. They talked about the weather, about a bridge on the North Road that had been closed for repairs for 6 months longer than anyone had been told to expect. He was a good talker, which she was not, but he was also a good listener, which was rarer and more valuable. At some point the conversation moved, naturally, to the forest, and from there to wildlife, and from there she told him one thing, just one, about what she had observed, something specific, about the way a wolf pack's movement patterns changed in the weeks before snowfall. He went very quiet when she said it, not the silence of disinterest, the silence of someone thinking hard. "I'd like to read whatever you've written," he said. She said she would think about it. She went home and sat with her notebooks for an hour. Then she brought 2 of them to the cafe the next evening and left them with the owner to give to him if he came in, because she was not ready to hand them over in person. He came back 3 days later. He brought the notebooks. He put them on the counter between them and said one sentence. "This is real work." She did not know what to do with that. She had been told so many versions of the opposite for so long that a simple, direct agreement hit her the way strong sunlight hits eyes that have been in a dark room. She looked at the notebooks rather than at him. She said nothing for a moment. "I know it's not formatted properly," she said. "That doesn't matter," he said. It took her a long time to believe that. She is not sure she fully believes it even now. But something shifted after that conversation. Not everything, not most things, but something. She and Wren began meeting occasionally to talk about the forest, about the wolves, about what she had been observing, and what he had been seeing from the official side of things. He worked for an organization that monitored wildlife populations, and he had access to data that she did not. Satellite tracking, population surveys, the broader mathematics of a pack's territory and movements. She had access to something that he did not, and that his organization had very little of. Years of close, careful, individual observation. The kind of observation that only comes from sitting still long enough that the animals begin to treat you as part of the landscape. They shared information carefully. She was not ready to share everything. He did not push. The years continued. The forest changed slowly, in the way forests change, imperceptibly, until one day, the change is obvious, and you realize it has been happening for a long time. The wolf pack in the northern section of the forest grew. A second pack established territory in the east. The farmers of Kirin grew more frustrated. There were formal complaints filed with the Regional Wildlife Authority. There were meetings, much like the meetings at Davin's house from her childhood, but now with official letterheads and representatives from the government, and people using the words sustainable management with great seriousness. Mara attended one of these meetings. She sat in the back row. No one asked her a question. When she raised her hand, the moderator thanked her for her attendance and moved on. She put her hand down. She left before it was over. She went home and wrote in her notebook for 3 hours. 2 years after that meeting, when she was 29 years old, Wren called her on a Thursday afternoon. He was not calling about the weather, or a bridge, or a shared observation. His voice had a specific quality. She had learned his voice well enough by then to read its qualities, that told her something unusual had happened. "There's been a situation at the relocation station," he said. The relocation station was a facility 40 miles from Kirin, where wolves that had come into serious conflict with human settlements were sometimes held before being moved to protected forest reserves further north. It was not a permanent facility, and it was not a comfortable one. It existed for emergency situations. "An alpha male came in 3 weeks ago," Wren said. "He was trapped near a settlement outside Halden. He's large, aggressive in captivity. They've had 3 handlers injured. Not seriously, but the relocation is scheduled for Sunday. They can't complete it. He won't allow any approach." She was quiet for a moment. "What happens Sunday if they can't complete it?" Wren was quiet for a moment on his side. "The decision moves up the chain." She understood what that meant. She had understood it before he finished the sentence. "What is his condition?" she asked. "Healthy, stressed, confined. They have him in a temporary holding space that's too small. He's been pacing for 3 weeks." She picked up a pen. Old habit. "How many people have tried to approach him?" 5 handlers. 1 specialist from the university program. All failed. She wrote nothing. There was nothing to write. She was thinking about a creek in November, about a young wolf with an injured leg, about 40 years of accumulated stillness that no institution had given her, and no rejection letter had been able to take away. "Who would I speak to?" she said. She called the facility director that evening. He was a man named Graber, who had the voice of someone who had been managing difficult situations for a long time, and had grown very good at sounding calm when he was not. He told her the same facts Wren had told her, in a slightly more official tone. He mentioned that they had already consulted with 2 nationally recognized specialists. He mentioned that Sunday was their final window before the decision would be escalated. He mentioned that he appreciated any input she could offer. I'm not offering input, she said. I'm saying I'll come and see him. There was a pause. Not a long one. I'm sorry. What is your background formally? She considered how to answer this. I've spent 15 years working directly with the pack in the northern section of the Kiran forest. I have detailed behavioral records for the period. I've had close contact with wolves on 11 occasions and indirect observation on far more. I don't have a formal credential. She let that sit. But the wolf is still in that enclosure, and you need him out of it by Sunday. Another pause. All right, said Graeber. Saturday morning then. 6 a.m. She was there at 5:45. The facility was a low building, set back from a service road, surrounded by a chain-link fence and the particular bleakness of functional, unloved infrastructure. She had been to many government buildings in her life, and they all had this quality. Built entirely for use, with nothing left over for beauty or comfort. She did not judge this. It was honest. Graeber met her in the parking lot. He was shorter than his voice had suggested, with the kind of face that had once been young and then simply stopped being young, without any clear transition. He shook her hand. He looked at her without expression, which was either professional courtesy or skepticism dressed in courtesy's clothes. She had seen enough of both to know she could not always tell them apart. He led her inside. Through a door, a corridor, another door. 2 handlers were in the outer room, both of them watching her with the specific alertness of people who had heard a claim they were not sure they believed, and were waiting to see how it resolved. She did not try to convince them of anything. She looked at a clipboard on a table and asked if she could see the behavioral notes from the previous approach attempts. One of the handlers handed her the clipboard. She read through it. The notes were thorough. Each approach attempt was documented. The handler's method, the wolf's response, the precise behaviors recorded. She read them twice. She noted in particular that every approach had been made from the front of the enclosure, which was the largest open space, but also the most exposed position from the wolf's perspective. She noted that none of the attempts had included more than 5 minutes of passive observation before physical approach. She noted the word aggressive used 8 times in 5 pages, and she understood that word to be doing less work than the people who wrote it thought it was. "Can I see him?" she said. Graeber led her through the inner door. The enclosure was perhaps 20 by 30 feet, chain link on all sides, a concrete floor, a single wooden platform, elevated 2 feet on the far side. The wolf was on the platform. He was very large. His shoulders were at a height that, even crouched as he was, suggested an animal that stood close to 3 feet at the shoulder when standing. His coat was black with silver at the edges, the kind of coloring that does not look entirely like any natural color, but like something that has absorbed all the available light and held it close. His eyes were amber. He saw her the moment she came through the door. She stood still. She did not look at him directly. She looked at the concrete floor of the enclosure, and then at the chain link on the left side, and then at the wooden platform. She took in his position in her peripheral vision, the angle of his body, the set of his ears, the placement of his weight, without giving him the direct confrontation of her gaze. She read him the way she read all of them, through everything except the eyes. He was afraid. That was the first and most important thing. Not aggressive. The behavioral notes had called him aggressive, and in the sense that he had responded to approach attempts with threat behavior, that was technically accurate. But threat behavior in a frightened animal is not aggression. It is communication. It is a voice that has only one word available to it, saying that one word very loudly, because no other word is working. She had known this since she was 14. She did not approach the enclosure. She sat down, right there on the concrete floor of the outer corridor. where the enclosure wall stopped and the observer area began. She sat with her back against the wall, her knees up, her hands visible and open in her lap. She turned her upper body 30 degrees to the left, away from the enclosure's front face, so that she was not presenting him with a full front position. She breathed. Behind her, she heard Graeber shift his weight. She heard one of the handlers whisper something to the other. She heard the fluorescent light above her make a small, persistent sound that she had not noticed before. The wolf did not move. She did not move. 5 minutes. 10. She was aware of the people behind her in the way she was always aware of people in these situations, as a background temperature, a pressure that she had to decide to not be distracted by. She let them be there without letting them be loud in her attention. She kept her breathing even. She looked at the concrete floor. 15 minutes. The wolf had not moved from the platform, but she felt, without looking directly, a change in the quality of his stillness. Not relaxation, not trust, but a shift from active alarm toward something that might be called uncertain attention. She knew this shift. She had felt it many times in many different animals. It was the moment when a frightened creature's body asks itself, "Is this threat real?" She let the question hang in the air. She did not answer it loudly. She answered it with the continued fact of her stillness, and her open hands, and her turned-away posture. She answered it by remaining precisely as she had been for the last 15 minutes. By being as completely as she could manage, a thing that did not escalate. 20 minutes. 25. She heard Graeber shift his weight again. She heard him draw breath as though he was about to say something. She did not look up. He did not speak. 30 minutes. The wolf stepped down from the platform. She heard this rather than saw it. The sound of large paws on concrete, the change in the ambient feeling of the room. She did not move. She kept her eyes on the floor. She breathed. She felt the wolf approach the inner face of the chain link, felt his proximity the way she had felt the proximity of the female with the thorn in her paw, like heat from a source you cannot see but know is close. He stopped at the chain link. She looked up then, slowly. She let her gaze travel up from the floor with the deliberateness of someone who is not in a hurry, and she found his eyes. Amber, close, complex with something she had spent her life trying to find words for. Not intelligence in the way humans use the word. Not emotion in the way humans claim to understand it. Something older than both of those things. Something that was simply the entirety of what a creature is, looking out from behind its eyes at the entirety of what you are. She held his gaze, not as a challenge, as a recognition. He held hers. 40 minutes had passed. She reached slowly into her coat and brought out the piece of dried venison she had put there the night before. The same thing she had always brought to the forest, out of habit, out of 15 years of preparation for moments exactly like this. She held it out, not toward the chain link, beside her own body, the same way she had held it out on the creek bank when she was 14, an offering that did not demand. He looked at the venison. He looked at her. He looked at the venison again. Then he lowered his head. Not all the way. Not a full bow. She would not call it a bow, exactly. What she would call it, if pressed, is this. He lowered his head to a point that placed his nose level with the chain link opening, which was the precise position from which he could take the piece of meat if he chose to. It was a practical movement. It was also, and she knew this, and every person in that room would later agree that they had felt it even if they could not explain why, an acknowledgement, a punctuation mark at the end of a long conversation conducted in silence. He took the meat from her palm through the gap in the chain link. He did not rush it. He ate it calmly. He stepped back one step. He sat down. She sat for another 10 minutes. Then she stood, slowly, and walked out of the enclosure area into the corridor, and stood with her back to the wall, and let herself breathe in a way she had not been breathing for the last 40 minutes. Graeber was standing 3 feet away. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Neither had he, probably. "That's the first time he's accepted anything from a human since he arrived," one of the handlers said. His voice was careful, as though he was reporting something that had been uncertain until the moment he said it out loud. She nodded. She said nothing for a moment. "He was never dangerous," she said. "He was afraid. 3 weeks in a space that size. After being trapped, he was communicating fear. Every time someone approached him, they were responding to the communication as though it were an attack. That made the fear louder." Graeber looked at her steadily. "How do we complete the transfer on Sunday?" She thought about this. "Slowly," she said. "Give him a full day with less human presence. Not none. He needs to understand that humans are not going to hurt him, not that they are going to disappear. But less. Have one person in the outer corridor for 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the afternoon. The same person, no approach. Let him hear one voice at a consistent time. By Sunday his stress level will be lower." She paused. "And change his platform placement. Move it to the left side, closer to the enclosure wall. He's been positioning himself in the center of the far wall, because there's no other cover. Give him a corner." She said this as though it were obvious. It was obvious to her. She had known for 15 years that a frightened creature needs to feel that something is behind it before it can afford to look forward. Graeber made notes. The handlers made notes. "And on Sunday?" Graeber asked. "I'll be here," she said. On Sunday, she was there at 5 in the morning. The transfer went slowly, the way she had said it would, the way everything worth doing goes slowly. It took 4 hours. She was in the outer corridor the entire time, sitting against the wall, and twice the wolf paused in his movement toward the transport crate, and turned and looked at her through the chain link, and she held his gaze both times, steadily, until he turned back and continued. The second time he looked at her, one of the handlers standing behind her said very quietly, "He's checking in with her." And no one responded to this because there was nothing to add to it. The wolf entered the transport crate at 9:47 in the morning. The door closed. He did not panic. He lay down. The handlers stood in the corridor, and no one spoke for a long moment. The transfer was completed. The wolf was relocated to the protected reserve 6 hours north, a forest large enough to hold him, with prey, with other wolves, with the particular darkness and depth that large animals need in order to be what they are. She drove home on Sunday evening in a car that smelled of coffee and the forest edge smell that had followed her since she was 7 years old. She did not call anyone. She did not stop anywhere. She drove through the village of Kirin, past the cafe and the general store and the farm at the western hill and the road that led south. And she kept going, past all of it, to the north road and the forest. She parked at the tree line. She walked to the edge of the field, the place she had been coming since she was 9 years old, in the early mornings before school. She sat down in the grass. It was evening, and the light was amber, and the shadows between the trees were deep. She sat there for an hour. Nothing came out of the forest. She did not expect anything to come. She had never been here expecting something. She had always been here to practice the waiting itself, to keep that skill in working order, to remain capable of the specific kind of stillness that 15 years had taught her was the only honest language she had. What happened after that Sunday took forms she had not predicted and would not have requested. Graeber made a report. The report mentioned the successful transfer and mentioned her involvement. Wren, who received a copy, sent it to a colleague at a wildlife conservation organization. The colleague called her. Then a researcher at an institute in the East called her. Then a newspaper in the city ran a short piece that someone had pitched without asking her, and the short piece became a longer piece because the journalist found the story interesting, which was the word that had lived in her chest like a splinter for years, but now felt different. The piece was read. Other pieces followed. She received, in the months after the Sunday transfer, 4 formal inquiries from research institutions, 2 invitations to speak at conferences, a request from the Regional Wildlife Authority to serve as an external consultant on human-wildlife conflict situations, and 1 letter from a woman she did not know, who wrote 3 pages about having always been the strange one in her family, and who wanted Mara to know that reading the newspaper article had made her feel less alone. She answered the woman's letter first. It took her 2 drafts and a week, and when she was done, she felt that she had written something more important than anything she had said to Graeber or to the journalist. She accepted the consultancy. She accepted one of the speaking invitations, the one that seemed most focused on the work rather than on her. She declined the others, not out of false modesty, but out of the knowledge that every hour she spent standing at a podium was an hour she was not at the tree line. She had a sense of what her hours were worth and to what they should be committed, and that sense had not changed. The farmers of Kiran who had lost livestock said the things they had been saying for years, some of them, not all of them. Devon's son, who had spoken about her at the general store with contempt, said nothing when he saw her in the autumn. He looked away. She did not need him to say anything. She had stopped needing that some years before, and she could not now precisely remember the moment she had stopped, only that it had happened gradually, the way things drain away without ceremony, and she was glad it was done. The village changed its use of the word wolf girl in the way that words change when the person they describe stops being easily located at the edge of something and becomes, instead, undeniably at the center of it. People said it now as though they had always meant it as a compliment. She did not correct them. Words were not her territory. Wren, on an afternoon in late November, walked with her to the tree line. They stood at the edge where the field stopped and the forest began. He was quiet for a while. She was quiet for longer. "The northern pack has extended its territory," he said finally. He was looking at the tree line. "The tracking data from last week shows them half a mile further east than last year." She looked at the shadows between the trunks. She felt, in the familiar way, the weight of large creatures that were present and had chosen not to be seen. The birds in the canopy were calm. The birds told her what she needed to know. "They're finding more deer," she said. "That's what we think." She nodded. She put her hands in her pockets and felt the piece of dried venison she had brought out of habit, as she always did, and had not needed today, as she often did not need it. She kept it anyway. It was not about the need. It was about being ready. There are things in this world that the world will not give you permission to know. Things it will call too strange, too informal, too lacking in the proper papers. The world will smile at you, politely, and tell you to come back when you have done the required things in the required order, and until then your knowing does not count. Mara had spent 20 years building something inside herself that no permission had authorized and no rejection could invalidate. She had built it in mud and leaves and cold creek water and gray November mornings when she went to the forest before the village woke up. She had built it in notebooks under a floorboard and in 40-minute silences in enclosures and in the slow accumulation of sitting still when every human instinct said to move. She had built a language, not the language of an institution, the language of an animal, the language of patience and proximity and the precise angle of a turned body in a field. The world had finally, reluctantly, begun to notice this language. She was glad, not because she needed the recognition. She had found out, a long time before it arrived, that she did not need it to continue, but because the wolves needed it. Because the better the human world understood what she understood, the better the chances were for the animals in the forests that were shrinking, for the packs that were being pushed south by drought and north by development, for the creatures that had no advocacy except from the people willing to sit still long enough to understand what they were actually communicating. That was what she worked for now, not for herself. She had given up the ambition of being understood for herself years ago. Somewhere between the second rejection letter and the third conference she had never been invited to. She worked for the usefulness of what she knew, for the application of 15 years of notebooks in the direction of something that would outlast her. On a Wednesday in March, 2 years after the Sunday transfer, she received a package from the relocation station. Inside was a photograph, taken from a trail camera at the reserve 6 hours north. The image was grainy, the way trail camera images always are, black and white, slightly blurred at the edges. The timestamp burned into the lower right corner. In the center of the image, clear enough, a large dark wolf, with silver at the edges of his coat, was standing in deep snow at the edge of a tree line. Standing at the edge, not inside the trees. Facing out, his ears were up. She kept the photograph on the kitchen table for 3 days, before she moved it to the wall above her desk. She did not put it in a frame. She pinned it with a single pin, level. She could see it from where she sat when she wrote. She kept writing. She kept going to the forest. She kept sitting still at the tree line in the early mornings, before the village woke up, when the air was cold and the birds were just beginning, and the shadows between the trunks held whatever they held. She was not waiting for something to come out. She had never been waiting for that. She was practicing the waiting itself. The waiting was the whole point. The waiting was everything she knew, and everything she had to give. And she gave it every morning, freely, to a forest that received it without comment and asked for more. The birds in the canopy went on. The shadows went on. The forest went on in its enormous, indifferent, living way. She sat at its edge, and she breathed, and she was still. And the morning came, as it always did, and the light moved through the trees the way it always had, and whatever was in there, and the silence was complete, and she was part of it. She had always been part of it. She had known that since she was 7 years old, sitting in the mud beside an injured dog, with her hands open and her breath slow and her whole body saying the one thing that she had spent a lifetime saying, the one thing she would always have to say. I am not here to frighten you. I am here. There is a quality to early morning light in the north that people who have not lived there cannot easily describe. It is not golden, not the warm theatrical light of photographs. It is white and direct and carries no sentiment. It falls on everything equally, on the beautiful and the plain, on the living and the dead, on the fields and the forest. It does not favor anything. In this, it is honest. Mara had grown up in this light. It had shaped her the way light shapes everything it falls on long enough. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a steady pressure that alters the substance of the thing over time. She was 32 now, and if you looked at her in that flat northern morning light, you would see a woman who had been shaped by weather and patience and decades of sitting outdoors in the early hours. Not hardened, sharpened. There is a difference. Hardened things are brittle, sharpened things are precise. She had a method now. Not just a personal practice, but something she had articulated well enough to share, carefully, with the people who asked for it. The Regional Wildlife Authority had begun referring situations to her, not frequently, and always with the hedge of multiple other consultants and official specialists preceding her, but referring them. She accepted the ones she could help with. She declined the ones where the situation was too far along, where fear had so thoroughly settled into both the human and the animal that the space for patience had closed. She was honest about this. She did not pretend to be capable of things she was not capable of. The methodology, as she described it to Wren one afternoon, when he asked her to put it into words for a report, was this: observe first, for longer than feels necessary. Identify the animal's primary concern. Determine whether the behavior being called aggression is actually aggression, or whether it is fear performing in aggression's clothes. Remove yourself physically as a source of pressure. Create conditions in which the animal can investigate you on its own terms. Bring something to offer, but do not offer it prominently. Be willing to leave with nothing. Return. Repeat. That's it? Wren said. That's it, she said. It sounds almost too simple. It is simple, she said. It is very, very difficult. These are different things. He put this in the report as a direct quote. She saw it months later, in the printed version, and felt something strange, reading her own words in formal type. Not pride, exactly. Something more like recognition. The feeling of seeing your reflection in a window you had not known was there. The consultancy expanded slowly. She remained based in Kirin, in the house where she had grown up, which she had bought from her parents when they retired south. She did not leave the village for any permanent move. People asked her about this sometimes. Didn't she want to be somewhere larger, somewhere with more resources, more colleagues, more of the infrastructure that professional life usually requires? She gave an honest answer. The forest was here. The packs she had spent 2 decades observing were here. The institutional memory she had built, the thousands of hours of recorded observation that made her useful in the first place, all of it was grounded here, in this specific place, in these specific trees. To move would be to abandon the foundation of the very knowledge people were asking her to apply. She was also honest with herself about a second reason, one she did not say out loud, but which was real. She was not sure she wanted to become the kind of person who moved. She had spent a long time being rooted here, even when being rooted here had meant being the strange one, the one who stayed when everyone sensible was supposed to go. To leave now would feel like agreeing, retroactively, that staying had been the mistake they'd always implied it was. She was not willing to agree to that. Lena, who had moved to a city in the West and had 2 children and worked in a school, came back to visit once a year. They had recovered the friendship in the way that long friendships can recover from damage, not by returning to what it was before the damage, but by building something new on the same ground. They met at the cafe, and they talked for hours, and Lena did not ask about the wolves in the careful way she had asked for years, giving them wide berth, but asked about them now directly and with genuine interest, because she had read the newspaper pieces and had shown them to her children with something that looked like pride. Mara understood this. She accepted it. She did not bring up the creek or the morning that had changed things between them. That morning was behind them, and the ground had regrown over it, and there was no reason to dig. The consulting work brought her into contact with people she would not otherwise have known. Researchers, mostly, and wildlife managers, and government officials of various ranks and temperaments. Some of them were curious about her background and respectful of it. Some were skeptical. The professional skepticism of people who have spent years working inside institutions that require credentials and who find it genuinely difficult to calibrate the weight of knowledge that arrived outside those institutions. She did not resent the skepticism. She had felt it directed at her for long enough to understand where it came from. She simply continued doing the work, because the work was the only argument she had ever had that was worth making. There was one researcher, a woman from a university 300 miles south, who studied wolf behavior and had published extensively, who came to Kirin in the spring of the year Mara turned 34. Her name was Dr. Soren. She came with the explicit purpose of spending a week observing Mara at the tree line, in the field, in the conditions where Mara's knowledge had been built. She had read the behavioral notes from the transfer facility. She had read Wren's reports. She wanted to see for herself. She was precise and somewhat guarded, the way people in her field often are, around claims they have not verified. She brought her own notebook. She did not speak much in the first few mornings, which Mara appreciated, since speaking at the tree line was pointless. On the fourth morning, they were sitting side by side at the edge of the field at 6 a.m., in heavy dew, when a wolf appeared at the tree line 40 meters to their left. Not one of the pack, a lone animal, younger, on the edge of establishing its own territory. It stood for a long moment, looking at them. Mara did not move. Dr. Soren, beside her, went very still. The wolf looked at them for perhaps 3 minutes. Then it went back into the trees. Dr. Soren let out a long, slow breath. "You knew it was going to come," she said. "The birds told me something large was moving near the edge," Mara said. "I wasn't certain what." "How long have you been reading the birds?" Mara thought about this. "Since I was 9. Dr. Soren wrote something in her notebook. She was quiet for a moment. "There's a gap in the academic literature," she said. "Long-term proximity observation of wild wolf packs by a single consistent observer. There are almost no studies of this kind, because almost no individual remains in the same location, with the same pack, for long enough. You have 15 years of this. 20, roughly." Dr. Soren wrote more. "I'd like to talk to you about a paper." Mara looked at the tree line. The birds were calm. Whatever had been moving through was gone now, deeper into the trees. "All right," she said. The paper took 8 months. It was the most difficult piece of writing she had ever done, and she had written some very difficult things in notebooks under a floorboard. The difficulty was not the language. She had taught herself enough of the formal register by then to navigate it, but the structure. Academic writing requires a particular kind of argument, a claim, and evidence for the claim, and a clear line between the two. Her knowledge did not come in that shape. It came in the shape of mornings and encounters, and the accumulated weight of being in one place for a very long time. Translating that shape into the shape the paper required was like moving water from one container into another. The substance was the same, but something about the form always felt slightly wrong. Dr. Soren was patient with this. She had a talent for asking questions that helped Mara find the formal structure inside the thing she already knew. Over 8 months of phone calls and shared drafts and long evenings at Mara's kitchen table, a paper assembled itself. It was 60 pages. It contained the behavioral observations, documented and dated, organized into categories. It contained the methodology, described with enough precision that someone else could attempt to replicate it. It contained analysis. It was, Mara thought when she finally read it in one sitting, the best possible version of the thing she had been trying to build for 20 years. It was accepted by a journal. Not the first journal they sent it to. The second. The rejection from the first came with a note that called the observational period impressive, but the methodology unconventional. And she filed the letter in the drawer with all the others, and then she closed the drawer, and the drawer was very full by now. And it occurred to her that she might simply stop keeping the rejection letters, since she no longer needed them to prove anything to herself. She threw the entire drawer's contents away on a Tuesday in February. It took less than a minute. She felt nothing in particular about it, which told her everything she needed to know about where she was now versus where she had been when she'd started collecting them. The paper, when it was published, was read. Within a year, it had been cited by 3 other papers. Within 2 years, it was being used in a graduate course on predator behavior. Within 3, she received an email from a researcher in another country who was attempting to develop a similar long-term observation protocol for a pack in a different region, and who wrote to ask her specific questions about the early years of proximity building. She answered the email in detail. She spent 2 hours on it. She attached 4 pages of notes. She did not know if the researcher across the world would succeed. Long-term observation requires years she could not give, and patience she could not transfer, and a specific quality of showing up every morning that no email could replicate. But she could give what she had, the precise description of how she had done it, the mistakes she had made and corrected, the things that had taken her years to understand and might take someone else less time if they had the map. She gave it freely. That is also a language. The language of one person building a thing alone for many years, and then, when the thing is built, turning it outward so others can use it. She had not had a teacher. She had spent a long time being sorry about that. In the private way, you can be sorry about a thing without letting it stop you. Now, she was the teacher. She did not require a classroom for this. She required only the willingness to answer emails in detail and return phone calls and speak plainly about what she knew and what she did not. The wolves in the northern section of the forest were having a strong season. The pack had grown to 12. A young female from the pack had paired with a lone male from the Eastern Territory and established a third presence at the forest's southern boundary, which brought her closer to Kieran than the others had been in years. Mara documented this with the same care she had always used. She updated the behavioral records she had been keeping for 2 decades. She noted changes in movement patterns, in how the pack responded to the new presence at the boundary, in the adjustment period that always followed any significant territorial shift. The farmers were nervous again. She went to 2 community meetings and said what she could say, that wolves regulate their own populations in response to prey availability, that the expansion of the Southern Territory was temporary and would stabilize, that the incidence of livestock loss typically decreased when early deterrent measures were in place rather than reactive ones. She said this clearly and without condescension. One of the men at the second meeting, not Devan's son, someone younger, asked her a real question and listened to the real answer, and at the end said that was helpful, and she believed he meant it. It was not everything. It was something. She had learned the difference between everything and something a long time ago, and had made her peace with working in the territory of something, reliably, rather than waiting for everything. Wren asked her one evening, when they were walking back from the tree line in the last of the autumn light, whether she was happy with how things had turned out. She walked beside him and thought about this honestly, the way she thought about everything, without rushing to an answer because a quick answer was expected, but also without making the question harder than it was. "I am glad the work is useful," she said. I am glad the wolves are better understood than they were. She paused. I am glad I stayed. He waited to see if there was more. I think that's the part I'm most glad about, she said. Not what happened later, just that I stayed when it would have been easier to go. He nodded. He understood this. He had known her long enough to understand that for Mara, the quality of a decision was measured not by its outcome, but by its consistency with the things she believed. She had believed in the forest, in the wolves, in the knowledge she was building there. She had stayed true to that belief for 25 years, through every form of doubt and dismissal the world had to offer. That the world had eventually come around was good, but it had not changed the quality of the original decision. The decision had been right before the world agreed. That was the only way she had ever understood rightness to work. The sun went down behind the trees, and the light on the field turned gray, and then gone. She stood for a moment at the edge of everything, the way she always did. The birds were settled. The shadows were deep. She put her hands in her pockets. She felt the piece of dried venison she had brought. She left it there. She turned and walked home. Behind her, in the forest, the wolves moved through the dark in their enormous, quiet way, following trails that had been there for centuries, following prey and each other, and the deep, ancient pull of the pack forward through the world. They did not know she was walking away. They did not know she thought about them every day. They did not know her name, or what she had done, or what she had given up, or what she had been called. They simply moved, as they had always moved, through the dark and the trees and the cold, being exactly what they were, with the completeness that only wild things can manage, full of themselves, and sufficient, and afraid of nothing that was not genuinely worth being afraid of. She had spent 25 years trying to learn that. She was still learning. There is a point in any long undertaking where the effort of it becomes invisible, even to the person making it, where what was once a conscious and deliberate act becomes simply the texture of a life. Mara had been sitting at tree lines long enough that she could no longer remember what it felt like to not do it. The practice had become her. The patient watching, the early mornings, the notebook entries, the careful translation of animal behavior into something human minds could use. These had ceased to be things she chose and become things she was. She had a name in the field now. Not the name that the newspapers had given her, the dramatic name they reached for because drama was what newspapers needed. A different name. The practical name that people in her discipline used when they sent each other emails or spoke at conferences in rooms that smelled of coffee and worn carpet. They called her the Kirin Observer. They cited her by name and her work by number. The way you cite things that are now part of the record. She had become part of the record. This was strange, and not strange. Strange because she had spent so many years being the person who existed outside every record, every credential, every sanctioned space. Not strange because the record had always been there, in 20 years of notebooks, waiting to be acknowledged. The record had not changed. Only the world's willingness to read it. She thought sometimes about the girl she had been at 14, sitting in the mud at the creek bank with her hands open and her breath slow, making no promises and asking for nothing, and hoping only to be understood as something that meant no harm. She thought about that girl with the uncomplicated tenderness you feel for a younger version of yourself who did not yet know how long the road was, but walked it anyway. That girl had been right about the important things. Mara was proud of her. She did not think she would have gotten here without her. In the late autumn of her 36th year, she received a call from a wildlife sanctuary in the northern mountains. A sanctuary, unlike a relocation facility, was a permanent home for animals that could not be returned to the wild for various reasons. injuries that had healed incompletely, animals that had been habituated to human presence too early, animals that had come in as orphans and grown up without the knowledge a pack would normally give them. The sanctuary called her because they were having difficulty with an elderly wolf, a male who had been there for 4 years and who had recently become isolated from the others. Not by any injury or illness the veterinary staff could identify, but for behavioral reasons that no one understood. She went on a Saturday. The sanctuary was high in the mountains, several hours north, and the drive took her through landscape that changed gradually from the flat farmland around Kirin into something rougher and more vertical, the kind of landscape that reminded her of why the northern forest had always felt like a deeper version of the world rather than an edge of it. She arrived in the early afternoon. The elderly wolf was in a large naturalistic enclosure that backed against a rocky slope. His name, in the sanctuary's records, was Seven. He was perhaps 11 or 12, which was old for a wolf. His coat had gone gray at the muzzle and along his back. He moved carefully, with the considered precision of old joints that knew their own limits. He was, the sanctuary director told her, eating well, sleeping, showing no signs of illness. But he had begun to separate himself from the 2 younger wolves he had previously lived alongside. He sat alone at the top of the rocky slope and watched the enclosure below him, and rarely came down. "He seems like he's waiting for something," the director said. "We don't know what." She looked at Seven on the rocky slope. He was looking back at her. His amber eyes, lighter now than they must have been in his youth, were steady on her face, with the particular quality of attention that very old animals and very old people sometimes have, the quality of having seen enough things that new things are no longer surprising, only interesting. She sat down at the base of the fence. The director started to say something, and she raised one hand, not in dismissal, but in request, and he went quiet. She sat for 30 minutes. Seven watched her for the first 10. Then he lay down on the rock, with his chin on his paws, and continued watching her but from a lower position. This was, she understood, the same communication she had been receiving and sending her entire life. "I am not alarmed. I am not going anywhere. I am here." She brought out her venison. She held it on her palm. She was 36 years old, and she had been doing this since she was 14, and it never felt routine. It always felt like the first time. The first time was always the whole point. Seven did not come down from the slope. She had not expected him to. He was old, and the slope was comfortable, and there was no reason urgent enough for old joints to make the journey just yet. She set the venison on the ground near the fence and sat back. She came back the following Saturday. He was on the slope again. She sat again. He came down after 40 minutes and ate the venison from the ground near the fence, close enough that she could have reached through the fence to touch him if she had wanted to, which she did not, because reaching was not what this was. She came back every Saturday for 2 months. On the 8th Saturday, he came down from the slope without waiting and sat at the fence while she was still settling herself against it, and she realized this was the first time in any of her encounters with any wolf that the animal had been there before she had finished arriving. She sat with that for a long moment. The 2 younger wolves in the enclosure had begun to come near when she visited. Not close. They kept a respectful distance from Seven's position, the way younger wolves keep distance from an elder's chosen space. But they came. The enclosure felt different when she was in it than when she was not. The director told her this. The sanctuary staff told her this. She did not know exactly what to make of it, except that stillness, over time, changes the air of a place, and animals feel that change, and they respond to it with a responding stillness of their own. Seven lived for another 8 months after her first visit. She came every Saturday until she could not, which was the last 3 weeks of his life, when he was too unwell for visits to be comfortable for him. She did not see him again after that. The sanctuary sent her a photograph when it was over. He had died at the top of his rocky slope, in the morning, in the sun. She put the photograph in a drawer, not the drawer with the rejection letters, a different one. She cried once that afternoon, briefly, in the kitchen, with her hands on the edge of the counter, and her head down. Then she washed her face and made tea, and sat at her desk, and wrote in her notebook about everything she had observed over 8 months of Saturdays, in the precise, careful language she had been developing since she was 14 years old. She did it because the observations were real, and real things should be recorded. She did it because someone somewhere might one day read what she had written about an elderly wolf on a rocky slope, and understand something about animal aging, or about the particular quality of presence that old animals have, or about what it looks like when a wild creature approaches the end of its life with the completeness it had always lived with. She did it because the work did not end when the animal did. She did it, finally, for the reason she had always done it, because it was hers to do, and no one else would do it if she didn't. And she had always understood that certain things in the world exist because one specific person keeps showing up to do them, and she was the person for this thing, and she showed up. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. In the morning she drove north to the tree line, which was hers and had always been hers, and she sat at the edge of the forest in the flat, honest northern light, with her hands open and her breath slow, and her whole body saying the only thing she had ever known how to say with certainty: I am not here to frighten you. I am here